Welcome to this new podcast. Today, we are undertaking a detailed architectural deep dive into one of the most magnificent and tragically short-lived monuments of the Islamic West, the Badīʿ Palace, located in the imperial city of Marrakech. When you walk the grounds of the Badīʿ Palace today, you are confronted by these, well, monumental ruins. You see vast sunken gardens, massive walls, the foundations of absolutely colossal structures, and it takes an enormous leap of imagination, really, to see it as it once was. A structure so spectacular that its name literally means the incomparable. Our mission today is a very specific one. We aren't just going to summarize the history or, lament the gorgeous decorations that were stripped away centuries ago. We are treating this building as a problem to be solved, looking at it through the lens of, say, a modern architect or engineer. We want the blueprint. We're analyzing the project and its detailed implementation to understand the technical and political genius that guided this extraordinary act of Sayyidine power in the late 16th century.
And that shifting perspective is crucial, I think. We're moving beyond the purely aesthetic, the sort of art of building or beaux-arts approach, and focusing on architecture as a scientific discipline. It's the rigorous study of space creation and the construction process itself. I mean, the marble and the vanished gold were the statement, absolutely, but the geometry was the language. We want to understand the minds that actually built it.
Right.
This means looking past the known patron, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, who everyone knows commissioned it, to the actual technical experts on the ground. So we're talking about the muhandis, the master engineers responsible for the geometry and proportions, and the malims, the master craftsmen who held generations of construction knowledge. They were the ones who had to translate that imperial ambition into mortar and stone.
Okay, let's unpack this by setting the historical stage first. Because before we can really analyze the blueprint, we need to understand the political context of its creation. I mean, this monument wasn't built during some quiet, stable era, was it?
No, not at all. It was built at the absolute zenith of a dynasty. It was indeed the statement piece of the Sayyidine Golden Age. The palace was commissioned by Ahmad al-Mansur, who became the sixth sovereign of the dynasty in 1578. His reign, which lasted until 1603, marked the undeniable high point of Sayyidine wealth and geopolitical influence.
This was a man of extraordinary ambition, right? He ascended the throne right after that pivotal battle of the Three Kings, the famous clash at Tsar el-Kabir.
Exactly. That victory in 1578 was huge. It eliminated a major Portuguese threat and, crucially, secured an influx of wealth, specifically a massive ransom demanded from the Portuguese nobility captured or killed there. Al-Mansur used that newly secured treasury, that windfall, to fund the construction of this palace almost immediately. Construction began shortly after his accession, situated strategically inside the Kasbah of Marrakech, just west of his existing private apartments.
That speed and scale, it suggests an immediate need to demonstrate that his power wasn't just temporary, maybe a fluke of battle, but permanent, and perhaps even divinely ordained.
Absolutely. It was a projection.
And the visitors, we know, were universally awestruck. European diplomats, local historians, they all described the immense scale, the intricate gardens, the sheer elaboration of the decor. This wasn't just a place to live. It was political theater aimed at a global audience, wouldn't you say?
Oh, completely. It was a conscious projection of strength and sophistication. But here is the profound challenge for historians and architects studying it today. The palace's splendor was incredibly fleeting. What we see now is impressive, yes, but it's the result of a deliberate, systematic destruction.
And the destruction itself is a major political event, isn't it? It wasn't just left to crumble or destroyed by invaders.
No, quite the opposite. It was done by his own successors, well, a successor dynasty. About 70 years after its construction, the Badi Palace was abandoned, largely demolished, and partially dismantled by the Alawi Sultan Moulay Ismail. He reigned in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and Ismail decided to shift the empire's capital from Marrakech north to Meknes.
That must have been an incredible logistical undertaking, not just abandoning a palace, but running what sounds like a giant salvage operation.
It was an unbelievable effort. They didn't just let it fall into ruin, they actively stripped it. And the demolition wasn't really an act of revenge or malice, but more an act of recycling on a truly colossal scale. Every portable, high-quality material, the precious Italian marble columns, the intricate Andalusian carved stucco, the cedarwood ceilings, the valuable Zellige tiles, was carefully removed and transported hundreds of miles north to be incorporated into Ismail's new palaces in Meknes.
Wow.
It was also a clear political statement. The glory of the Saadians was over, their capital was diminished, and the new center of power was now firmly in Meknes.
So we are left with foundations, walls, and this archaeological footprint. Trying to reconstruct this monumental project requires cross-referencing those ruins with what sound like very thin and sometimes conflicting historical records. What are the key source documents we're actually using?
Well, we have to rely on a mix of incomplete documents, and each gives us just a piece of the puzzle. None gives us the full picture, unfortunately. First, you have the eyewitness accounts. This includes Arab historiography, like al-Fishtali, who is al-Mansur's court historian, and also European travel or diplomatic reports. Now, while these documents excel at conveying the prestige of the Sultan, the vastness, the richness, the political theater he staged there, they are often frustratingly allegorical or focused on court life.
Meaning they focus more on the impression it made than the physical details.
Exactly. They focus on the political narrative, not on the physical architectural details we'd ideally want. We get emotional descriptors, lots of superlatives about gold and marble, but not blueprints or measurements. They tell us how great the palace was, how impressive, but not really how it was put together.
So they give us the atmosphere, maybe the intent, but not the engineering. What about the graphic evidence, the drawings made before the destruction? Are they more helpful?
Those are golden, even with their flaws. They're incredibly valuable. We have the engraving by Adrian Matham from 1640. Matham was a professional painter who accompanied a Dutch ambassador, so his work has a high degree of technical quality for its time. What's exceptional is its apparent precision, but its major limitation is that it only shows the exterior superstructures, the towers, the ornamental green-tiled roofs, the general silhouette against the Marrakech skyline. It gives us zero insight into the organization of the vast central courtyard or the internal reception spaces, which are really the heart of the design.
Okay, so we see the roof line, but not the floor plan. Then there's the Portuguese manuscript from 1585, the Escorial plan. I understand that's not much used geometrically.
It's important for the political context, yes, showing the palace within the whole royal quarter, but graphically. It's drawn in what we'd call a naive or schematic style. It's a colored sketch, almost map-like. It's useful because it allows us to recognize major elements mentioned in texts. The placement of the two great pyramidal pavilions, the location of the gardens, the presence of the basins. But you couldn't, trust it to calculate the length of a wall or the precise proportions. It's a helpful diagram maybe, but not a geometric survey.
Which brings us to the real architectural gem, potentially, the Golius-Windus plan from 1725. This plan sounds crucial, yet it was mislabeled as the Palace of Sèvres for decades. Why is it so essential to our understanding?
This plan is arguably the single most important pre-modern architectural document we possess for the Badi. Even though it was created well after the palace was already substantially ruined, it preserves details that the ruins alone have lost. While it's not geometrically flawless, its proportions are remarkably precise, much more so than the Escorial sketch. Crucially, it documents vanished elements. Things like the precise number and likely function of the surrounding rooms, the exact geometry of the access points, the location of stairs, and the precise arrangement of the multiple fountains within the courtyard.
So because it was drawn relatively early in the dismantling process, before everything was completely gone.
Exactly. It captures the memory of the full structure in a way the ruins alone can't. It's like an architectural snapshot taken partway through the demolition.
Okay, so relying on these disparate documents and the physical remains, what's the modern archaeological basis for our deep dive? What have recent studies added?
We really rely on two key phases of modern surveying. First, there's the essential 1955 Relève, the survey conducted by the French Monument Historique Service during the Protectorate. This provided the definitive foundation plan, the baseline for all future interpretations and conservation efforts. But the real game changer, I'd say, came much more recently with the work of the Spanish team led by Antonio Almagro between 2008 and 2016.
What innovation did Almagro's team bring that fundamentally changed our understanding of the palace? What did they do differently?
Well, they employed sophisticated modern techniques, notably high-precision photogrammetry and 3D laser scanning. This allowed them to create incredibly detailed, three-dimensional digital models of the existing ruins. And based on this very precise digital model, cross-referenced with the historical plans like Golius, Windus, they produced a detailed hypothetical restitution, a complete visual reconstruction, essentially.
So not just a flat plan, but...
Exactly. They didn't just draw the plan. They modeled the sections, the elevations, the facades. This allowed them to confidently place back key vanished elements, like the porticos, the colonnades that we know line the massive courtyard, and even suggest the internal partitions of the great halls. It transformed the Badi from a historical curiosity into a three-dimensional architectural project we can really study and analyze.
That ability to transition from two-dimensional sketches and fragments to a full three-dimensional hypothesis, that's what allows us to truly start treating the Badi not just as a ruin, but as a solve architectural problem designed by human hands. Which moves us neatly into Section 2, the project and the patron. If we see architecture as a process, an act of creation and mediation, like you said, we have to talk about the creator. We know the patron, the commanditaire, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, who paid for it and presumably had the vision. But who was the actual master builder? Who drew the plans?
And this is where we run into the fascinating concept, especially for Western audiences, of architecture without an architect. In the Sassanian context, the name of the singular maître d'œuvre, the chief designer, the architect in our modern sense, is completely absent from the historical record.
It feels counterintuitive for a monument of this scale and complexity. I mean, we're building this during the High Renaissance in Europe. Architects like Michelangelo and Palladio are becoming famous individuals, signing their works, writing treatises, asserting their singular genius. Why the difference in Marrakech?
The cultural context is entirely different. In Morocco at that time, the central signature role for a single designer, which was emerging and being celebrated in the Christian West, was simply not the norm for large-scale projects like this. The creation of the Badi was almost certainly a complex, hybrid, and profoundly collective work.
Collective in what way?
Well, you had the Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, who was the ultimate visionary. He articulated his desires, his political demands, his dreams of power, as the sources sometimes put it. He knew what message he wanted the building to send. Then you had the practical experts, the Malims. These master craftsmen were the absolute backbone of Moroccan construction. They possessed deep, practical, and often orally transmitted knowledge of materials, techniques, local styles, ornamentation, everything needed to actually build it and make it look authentically Moroccan.
So the Malims understood how to build a beautiful palace that looked right, that felt right within the tradition, but maybe they didn't necessarily handle the complex geometry on this monumental scale. Is that fair?
That's likely where the Muhandis, the engineers, came in. They were necessary for the advanced geometry, the precise layout over such a huge area, the sophisticated water management systems for the basins and gardens, and the overall tracing process to ensure such massive dimensions maintained perfect symmetry and proportion. So the design wasn't handed down fully formed from one genius designer. It likely emerged from a continuous, dynamic negotiation, maybe even daily discussions on site between these three groups: the Sultan, the engineers, and the master craftsmen.
That makes the process sound much more decentralized, more organic, maybe. It was a fusion of the Sultan's external knowledge. We know he had spent time in Istanbul. He was aware of European powers and styles, blended with local traditions held by the Malims and the specialized technical knowledge of the Muhandis.
Precisely. The Muhandis provided the mathematical framework and structural solutions. The Malims ensured local authenticity, beauty, and construction feasibility. And the Sultan ensured the final result conveyed the right political message of power and legitimacy. So while no single person signed the blueprint, the sheer ambition itself, the gigantism, the complexity, firmly places the Badi in the category of grand architecture. It wasn't built primarily for comfort or domesticity. It was built to speak, to declare the nature of the new Saadian imperial order.
It is an architecture that functioned explicitly as a political speech, carved into the land. That political function is what leads us directly to the conceptual design in Section 3. If the primary purpose was to stage the monarch's power, what symbolic roots was Ahmad al-Mansur drawing upon when conceiving this space?
Well, when we examine the massive spatial arrangement of the Badīʿ Palace, particularly that huge central court, it's almost impossible to ignore the echoes of the Saadian military and administrative structure, specifically the Sultan's mobile camp known as the Mahalla.
The Mahalla. Tell us more about that. How does a temporary arrangement of tents translate into a permanent stone palace? It seems like a leap.
The Mahala was absolutely essential for Sasanian rule. In that era, particularly in North Africa, the monarch's authority wasn't just fixed by, lines on a map. It had to be constantly renewed and asserted through these massive expeditions. These could involve thousands of people, soldiers, administrators, courtiers, servants moving across vast territories. It was basically an itinerant, temporary city that was set up and taken down, sometimes daily. And the organization of the tents within that moving city was absolutely rigid and deeply symbolic. By reproducing the structure day after day, the camp itself demonstrated that the kingdom possessed a visible, movable center, and that center was unequivocally the Sultan. So the Badīʿ Palace can be seen as the ultimate conceptual transposition, taking that ephemeral, sacred, and military camp organization and casting it into permanent, colossal stone architecture, making the temporary power permanent.
So the layout of the camp was literally a physical map of the hierarchy of power. How was that spatial hierarchy expressed in the tent arrangement?
It was a really interesting balance between sacralized, protected centrality and public, almost theatrical expression of power. The heart of the camp was the Ifrag. This was a large cloth enclosure, a sort of inner sanctum that contained the Sultan's private tents and the harem, the sacred forbidden space. Within the Ifrag was the Sultan's own tent, the Quoba, often described as being topped with golden spheres, visibly marking the absolute center of the Saadian world.
And the power projected outwards from that protected center, presumably.
Exactly. The main reception tent, where the Sultan would receive envoys, tribal delegations, or his own officials, would deliberately open onto a massive open plaza or field, the Mushala. This plaza was the public stage for power. Military drills, cavalry demonstrations, public receptions, the distribution of gifts, allegiance rituals. It was where power was performed. And the surrounding tents of the high officials, the viziers, the military commanders would be arranged around this open space, typically forming a large U or sometimes a V shape, with the Sultan's Quoba positioned as the central commanding figure at the head of the arrangement.
That U or V shape is very distinct. Are those shapes purely military in origin, or do they have deeper roots in the region? Is that a common pattern?
That's a great question. And they seem to have deep historical resonance. Anthropological studies suggest that this kind of spatial organization, centered around a powerful figurehead projecting authority into an open field, is deeply rooted in North African Berber traditions and concepts of leadership and territory. It's a very old symbolic grammar of power, if you like. You even find architectural echoes of these U or V shapes, these open-ended enclosures, in ancient Saharan funerary monuments, like the monumental stone alignments known sometimes as antenna or keyhole structures.
Wow, really? That far back?
Yes. It suggests a potentially long-standing symbolic connection. The fundamental layout used for a powerful person's ephemeral camp, their temporary dwelling, might also inform the structure of their eternal monument, their tomb or palace.
So the palace is built, conceptually at least, on the blueprint of the warrior's camp. But the Badi is equally famous, or perhaps more famous in descriptions, for its luxurious gardens and water features. That implies a fusion of this warrior model with a more peaceful, cultivated model.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what we can call Model A in this hybridization, the garden. Specifically the Andalusian garden, the riad. The riad provides the basic spatial structure that you see reflected, albeit on a massive scale, in the body. Rooms or pavilions surrounding a symmetrical central space, often quartered into 4 garden plots, with water, a fountain or basin at the absolute center. The garden itself is a potent metaphor for paradise in Islamic tradition, and the water is critical. It symbolizes fertility, life, purity, and it geometrically orders the entire space.
The Spanish influence, Al-Andalus, must have been overwhelming for the Saadians, culturally and architecturally.
It was absolutely crucial. The Badīʿ Palace represents a spatial hybridization drawing heavily from the Alhambra complex in Granada, which al-Mansur and his builders would have known intimately, either directly or through craftsmen and inscriptions. Specifically, he appears to have consciously fused elements from the Alhambra's 2 most famous main patios.
Which one?
From the Patio de los Leones, the Court of the Lions, they seem to have taken the idea of having 2 prominent, freestanding pavilions facing each other across the space, establishing the main axial focus. And from the Patio de los Arianes, the Court of Myrtles, they clearly took the concept of the long, rectangular, axial basin of water dominating the center of the courtyard and reflecting the architecture. What al-Mansur and his team did was take that successful, prestigious template and apply the principle of gigantism. We have to remember, the Badi central court is roughly 6 times the area of the Patio de los Leones. It's an exercise in scale designed to overwhelm and surpass the original.
So it sounds like he wasn't just copying, he was deliberately amplifying.
Yeah.
Taking the best-known symbol of sophisticated Islamic power in the West, the Alhambra, and making his own version vastly bigger and arguably more elaborate. A statement of succession, almost.
Exactly, and the influence probably didn't stop at the Alhambra. Other studies suggest the conceptual layout of the central exterior space, its classical division into 4 sunken gardens surrounding that long axial basin, also shows strong influence from the earlier royal palace of Murcia, the Alcázar Menor, another key Andalusian site. This really confirms that the Saadian designers were deliberately selecting, synthesizing, and then scaling up the most compelling and successful elements from the entire Hispano-Moorish architectural tradition they inherited.
Now, you mentioned a Model B earlier, the Eastern or imperial influence. Given al-Mansur's extensive travels before becoming Sultan and his diplomatic ties, particularly with the Ottomans, how did he incorporate those maybe more global imperial aspirations into the design?
Al-Mansur was certainly a globally aware sovereign for his time. His diplomatic links with the Ottoman Empire were extensive and sustained throughout his reign. He'd spent time in Istanbul, so he was certainly aware of other major imperial projects happening across the Islamic world, particularly the massive reconstruction and expansion of the Topkapi Saray in Istanbul, which was happening contemporaneously under Sultan Murad III. Now, while there's no real evidence of direct architectural features being copied from Istanbul, the Badi remains stylistically firmly within the Maghrebi Andalusian sphere. It doesn't look like Topkapi. The shared characteristic is definitely ambition and scale.
An architectural competition, maybe?
In a sense, yes. The gigantism, the meticulous internal division of functions within the palace complex, and the principle of juxtaposing specialized edifices centered around massive formal courts. These were shared characteristics of imperial architecture across the globe at that time, designed to project overwhelming power, wealth, and administrative complexity. It showed he was playing in the same league as the Ottomans.
So the final conceptual design is this complex layering. You've got the ancient military and symbolic structure of the Berber camp, the Mahalla, then the geometric and spiritual perfection of the Andalusian Riyadh garden. And all of it amplified to a scale intended to rival his Ottoman contemporaries. It's power and paradise achieved through geometry and sheer size.
That hybridization is absolutely key. The Badīʿ is built on the tension, or maybe the synthesis, between the open power staging model of the Mahalla camp and the closed, protective, cultivated model of the Riyadh or inner sanctuary. And that perhaps reflects the complex role of al-Mansur himself, the powerful military commander who had secured his kingdom through battle, but also the cultivated, aesthetic, learned, and intellectual patron who appreciated beauty and order.
Okay, now that we understand the why, the political and symbolic roots, the models they were drawing on, we can finally move to the how. This is the part where we try to become those muhandis you mentioned and attempt to reverse engineer the project. How on earth did the master builders translate this colossal, perfectly symmetrical vision onto the actual ground using 16th century tools?
Right. The goal here is to try and find the simple, repeatable technical procedures they likely used. We aren't looking for complicated calculus or trigonometry. We're looking for geometry based on simple tools we know they had. Basically a rope, some stakes, and crucially, a reliable unit of measure. Lines, circles, squares.
Let's start with the dimensions. That central space is huge. It's at about 150 meters by 106 meters. Does this follow classical mathematical rules like the golden ratio?
Interestingly, no. Not the classical Western golden ratio, which is about 1.618 to 1. If you divide the length roughly 150 meters by the width, about 106 meters, the resulting ratio is approximately 1.414 to 1.
1.414. What's significant about that number?
Well, that is the ratio known mathematically as the square root of 2. Architecturally, and this is the clever part, it's the ratio you get very simply by tracing the diagonal of a square and then using that diagonal's length to define the new, longer side of a rectangle.
Okay. So you just need a square and a rope.
Exactly. It's an incredibly practical method for achieving harmonious, dynamic proportions using the simplest geometric construction methods available, literally rope and stake geometry. This strongly suggests that the design was driven by construction practicality and an accessible geometric elegance, rather than some esoteric mathematical theory imported from elsewhere. It was buildable.
That's genius in its simplicity. But to verify that geometry and to understand the whole layout, we need to know the basic unit of measure they started with. You mentioned the Saadian cubit.
Exactly. Finding the unit of measure is crucial, and it's also a political and technical detail in itself. We know that previous ruling dynasties in Morocco had their own standard cubits. The Almoravid cubit was about 0.54 meters. The succeeding Almohad cubit was a bit longer, around 0.62 meters. Often, when a new dynasty asserts power, they also assert a new measure for the land, for trade, for construction. It demonstrates their unique authority and establishes their own technical system. So, based on analyzing contemporary Sayyidine structures built under al-Mansur, like the major mosques of Muwassin and Bab Dukala in Marrakech, which were also imperial projects with clear proportional systems, the modern hypothesis, the consensus now, is that the Sayyidine cubit, the Code, measured approximately 0.775 meters, longer than its predecessors.
A new kingdom, a new ruler, a new measure of space. It makes sense. So if we apply that 0.775 meter cubit to the tracing of the Badi Palace, what does the core dimension become? How does it fit?
Well, the overall available space they seem to have been working with. The total footprint of the palace complex, which was likely constrained by pre-existing structures, was approximately 155 meters by 155 meters. And if you divide 155 meters by 0.775 meters, it translates almost perfectly to 200 cubits by 200 cubits.
Wow, a perfect square, 200 Sayyidine cubits on each side. That must have been the fundamental starting point, the bounding box for the entire complex. Okay, let's try and walk through the tracing process. You mentioned 7 steps that the Mohandis would likely have followed to lay this incredibly complex design out on the ground.
Right. The initial complexity, the sheer scale, must be managed by an underlying simplicity in the method. The evidence suggests the entire colossal design is generated from defining a single center point and then using a rope to trace out squares and circles from there. So, step 1, defining the center. The Mohandis began by establishing the position of the central fountain. Let's call it point O. This was the absolute heart. They had to ensure the central point and the main axes running through it were perfectly parallel to the solid north rampart of the existing Kasbah wall, which was a primary physical constraint they couldn't ignore.
Okay, center point fixed relative to the existing wall. Step 2.
Step 2. Define the foundation square. A massive 200 by 200 cubit square is then staked out on the ground, centered implicitly on point O. The size of this square, as we said, seems determined by the existing constructions. The Kasbah wall to the north, and likely the edge of the older Almohad palace structure to the south, which housed the Sultan's private quarters. This outer square is then divided into 4 quadrants by 2 main central axes crossing at point O.
Simple enough so far. Big square, find the middle. What's step 3?
Step 3, the geometric heart. This is where the real geometric cleverness seems to lie. They didn't just rely on the main orthogonal square, they used the diagonals. The analysis suggests a second, smaller square was placed on the diagonal within the main 200 by 200 square. The vertices, the corners, of this smaller, diagonally oriented square correspond precisely to the centers of composition for the 4 major axial spaces of the palace complex.
And which 4 spaces are those again? The main pavilions.
Exactly. They are the 2 main reception pavilions. The southern one, the audiences pavilion, known as Quba al-Khamsiniya, or Hall of 50 Cubits, and the northern one, the famous crystal pavilion, Quba al-Lajaj. And also the centers of the 2 main lateral salons on the east and west sides, the Green Salon and the Myrtle Salon. By defining a perfect square that geometrically links the symbolic focal points of imperial reception, the geometry itself dictates the political organization of the space. It locks everything together.
That is incredible. So the most important halls are geometrically bound to the center in this perfect 4-fold symmetry derived from a diagonal. Okay, how did they then move from that internal conceptual square to defining the massive outer perimeter of the main courtyard?
Step 4, defining the perimeter. They returned to point O, the center fountain. Using a rope set to a 100 cubit radius, which is exactly half the side length of the initial 200 cubit foundation square, they traced a large circle. The points where this 100 cubit radius circle intersect with the diagonals of the initial square, the ones used to define the inner diagonal square, establish the precise lines for the north and south facades of the palace courtyard, the inner edges facing the main pavilions.
So, using one simple radius from the center, they defined the maximum extent of the core building north to south. It really reinforced the idea that the entire complex was conceived simultaneously, tied geometrically back to that single central point O.
Absolutely, it's very elegant. The subsequent steps then refine the interior layout based on this framework. Step 5 involves tracing smaller squares, likely derived from divisions of the main axes, to accurately define the width and the central axis of the porticos, those covered walkways that run in front of the main salons, and also the precise center lines of the pavilions themselves.
Okay, laying out the walkways and pavilion positions. Step 6.
Step 6 builds on that. A slightly larger parallel square seems to be drawn, this time connecting the geometric centers of the four main structures, the two pavilions and the two salons, not just their internal focal points established by the diagonal square. When the sides of this larger square are projected outwards, they define the exact diagonal composition lines for the square-based pavilions themselves, ensuring their external structure aligns perfectly with the main axes and the overall grid. It helps define their footprint.
Right, so it's about aligning the actual buildings now. And finally, step 7 ties in the symbolic core of the palace, the water features. How does the geometry dictate where those massive basins go?
The centers and lines defined in the previous steps are used directly to trace the outlines of the lateral basins and, crucially, the massive central basin that dominates the courtyard. And here is a key proportionality check. The analysis shows the length of the Grand Central Basin is almost exactly equal to the side length of that major interior square we defined back in Step 6, the one connecting the centers of the four main buildings. This confirms that the builders weren't just adding the water features in afterwards wherever they fit. The water, the gardens surrounding the basins, and the buildings were all designed, measured, and laid out concurrently, derived from the exact same initial geometric structure originating from point O. It's a totally integrated design.
It's a phenomenal demonstration of how relatively simple, accessible geometry squares, diagonals, circles could generate immense complexity and perfect order on an imperial scale, using just ropes and stakes. It also brings into sharp relief the constraints the Mohandes and Mullums must have been working under.
Yes, the constraints are paramount to understanding the final result. The tracing makes it clear that they were imposing an ideal, perfect geometry, the 200 by 200 cubit square, the symmetrically derived water features, onto a very real, somewhat irregular, and definitely constrained site. They had to compose while respecting the rigid lines of the existing north ramparts of the Kasbah, which they used as their baseline, and also the location and orientation of the private, older Almohad palace structure to the south, where the Sultan actually lived. The space available likely dictated the initial 200 by 200 cubit dimension, and the genius of the Mohandes was in fitting perfection within those real-world limits.
This deep dive into the Badīʿ Palace's architectural blueprint, it offers us such profound insight into the mechanics of Saadian power, the transmission of architectural ideas, and the incredible skills of their master builders and engineers. So let's try to summarize the key takeaways.
Well, I think our first key takeaway must be that the palace was fundamentally an operational political instrument. By successfully transposing the temporary, mobile structure of the Mahala camp into permanent, colossal stone architecture, Ahmad al-Mansur was solidifying the image and thus the perceived permanence and legitimacy of the Saadian Empire's power. It was a declaration that the king's center, his authority, was now immutable, fixed in stone.
And we saw how deeply this political need for centrality, but also for protection, influenced the very placement of doors and the use of axes within the design.
Absolutely. The design clearly prioritizes a centered, yet highly protected space for the ruler. This emphasis helps explain a fundamental difference you often see in classical Arab Muslim architectural tradition compared to, say, the European Renaissance or Baroque tradition. In Western classical architecture, you frequently have a monumental main door placed directly on the central axis to welcome visitors and impress them immediately with a direct vista. In the Badi, as in many palaces of the era, entrances are deliberately discreet, often non-axial, sometimes using elbowed or bent access routes.
Why is that? To obscure the view.
Precisely. To deliberately obscure the direct view into the heart of the palace. The main axis, the powerful line of sight, is reserved exclusively for the places of prestige and seating, the center from which the Sultan himself would project his authority outwards. It controls the gaze.
Fascinating. And finally, the water. We saw it was integral to the geometry, but it wasn't just decorative. It was politically charged, wasn't it?
Immensely so. The meticulous integration of water, the numerous fountains, and the massive basins derived precisely from the initial geometry served a crucial symbolic purpose. By positioning the Sultan, the builder of this perfect, well-watered garden paradise, as the master of water, he was symbolically proclaiming himself the ultimate guarantor of fertility, prosperity, and the very lifeblood of the land. That's a potent and absolutely necessary message in an often arid kingdom like Morocco, which was heavily dependent on sophisticated irrigation for its wealth and survival. He controlled the water, he controlled life.
This analysis gives us a tremendous, much clearer vision of the structure, the geometry, the political intent, and the sheer skill involved. But if we look at this architectural project one last time, thinking about what it represented, what is the single most compelling mystery or question that still lingers about the palace's purpose or meaning for you?
For me, the most provocative, unresolved question hangs over one specific architectural element. The northern pavilion, the pavilion of crystal, the Quba al-Zujaj. Why that specific name? Crystal suggests transparency, perhaps effacement, lightness, maybe even illusion. Was it simply an open-air pavilion for leisure overlooking the gardens? Or did its name and placement define it as something much more conceptual?
What do you mean by conceptual?
Well, it forces us to consider the underlying archetypal forms the palace is trying to mediate between. Was the Quba al-Zujaj possibly designed as a strategic architectural threshold? A point of clear, light, almost invisible passage? Perhaps a mediation point between the highly ordered, geometric, public, and ceremonial space of the Badi garden court itself and another, less formal, possibly more liberated or private space beyond it to the north? Maybe that adjacent area known historically as the Crystal Garden, the Arsat al-Zujaj.
So a point of transition, almost a gateway between the public world of geometry and power and maybe a more private world of reflection or pleasure.
Exactly.
Okay.
The palace and its very hybridity that we discussed, drawing from the camp and the garden, perfectly captures that eternal tension in imperial power. The need for the open but centered space, the ephemeral military camp structure that publicly asserts control over territory, and the competing need for the closed and centered space, the permanent protective riad or domestic sphere, the inner sanctum. The Crystal Pavilion, by its very name and position, may have been the architectural hinge, the liminal point where those two worlds met or transitioned. And if so, it makes the Badīʿ Palace not just a monument to power, but a lasting architectural meditation on the complex relationship between power, nature, impermanence, and geometry itself.